Hey guys, it's Mrs. Gebhard, and I am going to be giving you my introduction to poetry lesson today because I'm not going to be here. So here we go. Intro to poetry and rhyme. Today we're going to understand the difference between poetry and prose and play with rhyme and rhythm a little bit. So I'm going to talk to you about what poetry is, about rhyme and rhythm. We're really going to focus on rhyme today, and then look for examples in your poetry books and do some partner work. Today's trivia, U2's song Shadows and Tall Trees off its debut album. Maybe you guys are too young for U2, but they're still touring, and I think they came to St. Louis sometime around here. So do you know it? Took its title from a chapter in this well-known novel. Think about it, pause it, Lord of the Flies. Homework is to complete the rhyme poem on Google Classroom, and we'll go over that at the end, but just go on there. It's pretty self-explanatory. All right, so notebook's out. You want to write these few terms down. This will be important. So go ahead, pause it if you need to, take your notebook out. So there's two types of writing, prose and poetry, and we're going to be focusing on poetry now. I mean, pretty much all writing is divided up into these two categories, and drama really fits into prose. So the definition of prose, so if you ever hear that term, is ordinary speech or writing using sentences and paragraphs. For example, I went to the store and bought some milk. That's pretty basic, right? Or turn in your homework at the beginning of class. Novels, short stories, like I said, even drama, all written in prose sentences, right? Some drama also written as poetry. We can get into that later. Poetry is the other category. Poetry is writing in verse, which means it uses lines and stanzas. So when you're talking about a poem, you'll never say the paragraph of a poem. You'll say the stanza, and you'll never say the sentence. You'll say a line. And a line is not necessarily a complete sentence. So for example here, shall I compare thee to a summer's day? I mean, I think technically that is in one line in the poem, but the way that this is mapped out on the page, this would be line 1. Oh, never mind. Back. I forget that I can't edit on. This would be line 1 here. Shall I compare thee to a? Summer's day would be line 2. Thou art more lovely and more would be line 3, and temperate would be line 4. So it's not a complete sentence. It's whatever appears on the line. Sometimes it's just one word, right? And that's how we break this up. Also, when we talk about poetry, I mean, there's so many definitions that you could use to describe poetry. This is my favorite one because it's pretty general, and also something that I think I can agree with is a heightened and compressed form of language. So when we think about poetry, we're really looking at like a conservation of words. Now, more contemporary poetry mixes some of these things, or you have Allen Ginsberg. He writes a lot of prose poetry where we kind of blend the genres. And if you take creative writing too, we will be doing prose poetry. But more free verse poetry can kind of get blended, and you think, why is this not prose? Why isn't this called prose? Why is it called poetry? Like I said, a lot of times those more contemporary ones especially. I gave my friend Mrs. Rice a poetry book, a contemporary one from one of my favorite poets a couple of years ago, and she looked at it and she read it and she said, I just don't understand how this is poetry. And I got it, right? Because it seems like it's just ordinary speech. But there's a lot more going on in that, right? So every word has a purpose, even if it's not rhyming in the poems or anything else. Like every word has a purpose, and you much more carefully craft where you break lines, what you put where, the organization, those very specific word choices. There's a little bit more art in crafting the poetry, I would say, than ordinary prose. Okay. So let's talk about rhyme. That's the first thing we're going to talk about in poetry. I am not a rhymer with my poetry in the sense of traditional rhyme schemes. However, I do love some rhyming poetry and some old poetry. Robert Frost is what we're going to look at in a minute. Just because you don't want to use a rhyme scheme doesn't mean you won't use rhyme in your poetry. So I know you guys probably all know what rhyme is. However, the technical definition of rhyme is words that correspond in terminal sounds, in the end sounds. So the end part of the word, not necessarily the end part of the line, not the beginning part of the word. So here, like die and fly, obviously rhyme. The beginning letters, the beginning sounds are different. We have a D and an F, which are different, but the ending sound, the terminal sound, the I sound at the end is the same. And so that's why this rhymes. So here's an example. I believe this is Langston Hughes' poem, Hold Fast to Dreams, for if dreams die, life is a broken-winged bird that cannot fly. In this stanza, we have two words that rhyme. And if you see over here, I have A, B, C, B. That is the rhyme scheme for this stanza. A rhyme scheme is a pattern that poets might use. And a lot of more traditional poets used rhyme scheme. And then we had some more contemporary poets come along. Walt Whitman, if you're familiar with him, and we'll look in his book is here in my classroom. He's one of my favorites. He's sort of really pioneered. I mean, other people did it too, but he's sort of the go-to guy for this more free verse poetry. He still uses rhyme, but doesn't usually have a traditional rhyme scheme. He does have a rhyme scheme, if you're familiar with the poem, "O Captain, My Captain," which is also featured in Dead Poets Society. But a lot of his work does not. So there are 4 main types of rhyme, and you want to write these down in your notebooks as well. You'll need to be able to know these and identify these. The first type of rhyme, end rhyme, is what you're most familiar with, right? End rhyme is rhyme that comes at the end of the line. When we go back to this rhyme scheme page, right? This is end rhyme. Die and fly are at the end of the lines. But then you have slant rhyme. Slant rhyme is rhymes that are not exact but similar. So an example of that would be meet and grief. They aren't the same, right? The T sound and the F sound are clearly different, but that E sound is the same. And if you were creating a rhyme scheme or a rhyme pattern, you can use slant rhyme and it's totally acceptable, right? It's got enough of it in there that it keeps that rhythm. Internal rhyme is a rhyme within the lines of the poem. If you are familiar with Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven, he uses internal rhyme. Once upon a midnight weary while I wander, or once upon a midnight dreary while I wander weak and weary, all appears in the same line, and dreary and weary rhyme. We'll look at some other examples here in a minute. And then I rhyme. I rhyme is an interesting one because when you're thinking about rhythm and how it sounds, like these don't really work. But poets will still use these as part of their rhyme scheme, and it's just kind of a play with the I. So these words are not even close. They are not even a slant rhyme, right? Wreath and breath. Those are 2 very separate sounds, but poets, when they're trying to create a rhyme scheme, might use this anyways. It doesn't have the same rhythmic effect, but it can accomplish something. So here are 5 different examples. 3 of these are actually from one poem, Sylvia Plath, but I want you to take a minute and pause the video and number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and identify what type of rhyme is being used in each one of these. So go ahead, pause. Here I am waiting for you. And think about it. Okay, so let's bring it on back. When you're done, I guess I should have said that beforehand, you can unpause and we'll go over these. Number 1, and ahead in the freakish Atlantic where it pours bean green over blue. Bean green, right there, right next to each other. Bean and green rhyme. That's inside the line of a poem. So it's going to be internal rhyme. 2, this is from Jabberwocky by Lewis Carroll. 1, 2, 1, 2, and through the vorpal blade went snicker snack. He left it dead, and with its head he went galumphing back. And here we have internal rhyme, and we also have end rhyme, right? 1, 2, 1, 2, and through and through. Now through and 2 and 2, that's repetition. If it's repetition, you don't really need to say that it's rhyme because it's the exact same word. So even though it has that sound effect, repetition is stronger than rhyme. So I would identify that as repetition. But 2 rhymes with through, and that's your internal rhyme. Snicker, snack, and back rhyme, and that's end rhyme, right? And then dead and head, that's your internal rhyme. 3, so I never could tell where you put your foot, put your root. What do you think that is, right? I rhyme. Foot and root are spelled exactly the same. They look like they should rhyme, but they don't rhyme, right? Foot and root are very distinct sounds. 4, another Sylvia. Both of these are Sylvia, right? This poem's called Daddy. We'll read it. It's good. The boot in the face, the brute heart of a brute like you. So this, again, the brute and brute is all going to be repetition. That doesn't really count for rhyme. But we say the boot and the brute, right? Those are internal rhyme. It's happening on the same line. Internal rhyme can also happen in the middle of separate lines. And I don't have an example of that here, I don't think. But if you had boot here, well, like here, right? Even though this rhymes here, this boot and brute in these 2 separate lines, it's still inside the line. As long as it's occurring within like 2 or 3 lines, that probably counts as internal rhyme as well. And 5, this is Emily Dickinson. Like one in danger, cautious, I offered him a crumb, and he unrolled his feathers and rode him softer home. There you have a slant rhyme, right? Crumb and home do not rhyme. It is not the exact sound, but it's similar enough, and you can tell that she's using that on purpose. Crumb and home, it's just a slightly different vowel sound, and that's going to be part of a rhyme scheme, a pattern that she's trying to do intentionally. Okay? So I've talked about rhyme scheme, and if you want to write this down too, because I'll ask you to find the rhyme scheme of a poem or create your own rhyme scheme for a rhyming piece. And again, if you're not a rhymer, that's cool. Just try it out. I've written lots of poems that rhyme and follow a rhyming pattern. It helps your writing, always trying new things, but you don't have to have your best pieces or your favorite pieces be rhyming. That's cool. It's a set pattern that a poet uses to establish rhythm in a piece. Some forms of poems have a very specific rhyme scheme, like the sonnet. The sonnet has a very distinct pattern. There's 2 different kinds, and you are filling that pattern as you write that. The villanelle, which we'll do in creative writing too if you take that, that has a repetition scheme and a rhyme scheme with it. When you're finding the rhyme scheme of a poem, each end rhyme is designated a letter, A, B, C, etc. All the way up until if you're doing a really long poem, then you start repeating double A, double B, C, C, D, D, E, E, and it just keeps going on and on. You can see the pattern by plotting out the rhyme scheme. That's, yeah, of course, I have a typo there. So, for example, I bet you all are familiar with this poem, The Road Not Taken, and we are going to reread this in class and have a new perspective on it. But 2 roads diverged in a yellow wood, and sorry I could not travel both, and be one traveler long I stood, and looked down one as far as I could to where it bent in the undergrowth. Then took the other as just as fair, and having perhaps the better claim, because it was grassy and wanted wear, though as for that, the passing there had worn them really about the same. You hear it, right? It's got this rhythm, it's got this flow, and it has that end rhyme pattern. Think about the rhyme scheme or the rhyming pattern for this. Wood. So you start with the very first end, it's all end rhyme. That becomes A. And sorry I could not travel both. Does both rhyme with wood? No. So that becomes B. And be one traveler long I stood. Again, I'm looking only at the last word in the line. Does stood rhyme with either wood or both? Yes. So that will become A. Could, stood, another A, and undergrowth, both, B. Next stanza, fair. Does fair rhyme with any of these? No, that becomes C. So you don't repeat at the beginning of stanzas or start over your letters. The same rhyming pattern keeps the same letter throughout the whole poem. One thing you have to watch out for, which isn't in this piece, is if there was another stanza later on that had rhymes with wood or both or whatever, that goes back to that A. And some people miss that. A lot of times at the end of a piece, it'll go back to this A-B pattern and use some of those same words. So be wary of that as well. So if I was trying to plot out the rhyme scheme for this poem, I think I got it right here. This is what it would look like. So like I said before, A, B, A, A, B, C, D, C, C, D, E, F, E, E, F, G, H, G, G, H, right? There's a pattern. It's changing rhymes, through each stanza. It's creating new rhymes, but it's keeping that same pattern throughout. That's the rhyme scheme for this poem. Some will use just an A-B rhyme throughout an entire piece, right? You're only having 2 ending sounds, and that can be difficult. Some things to consider. Why we rhyme or why we use rhyme does definitely help with the sound, right? The sound of the poem as it's spoken out loud. When we're thinking about rhyme, it's really about how the poem sounds. Some of the techniques we'll use will be how it looks on the page or how it's written. Counting syllables in your lines helps create a rhythm. Can help create a rhythm. You don't have to have the same number of syllables, but keeping it consistent is helpful. Sometimes, always reading out loud will help you with your rhythm, and especially when you're trying to put a rhyme scheme in. If you have a really long line, and then the next line is short, and then the next line is medium, and then short, and then long again, sometimes it doesn't keep that same flow. Some people do long line, and then short line at the end, or long, short, are all about the same. But a syllable, right, is just a beat. So you could count like 2 roads diverged in a yellow wood. You have 9. And sorry, I could not travel both. That's 9 again. And be a traveler long I stood. That's 8. And look down one as far as I could. 9. To where it bent in the undergrowth. 8. All, and that follows that rhythm, right? If you had one that was way off, that might not be as pleasing when you're reading it out loud. You can use slant or I rhyme when creating a rhyme scheme 100%. So if you're trying to follow a pattern, like the most important thing with poetry is choosing the just right word. So sometimes a word that rhymes exactly is not that just right word. Every word counts in a poem, right? Every word counts. You don't want to have all that filler, and you want to make sure every word, and that sometimes it'll take me 30 minutes to find the right word to use in a poem, right? But that's what crafting a poem is all about. One thing that can be helpful is you can use a rhyming dictionary to help to find the words to use, but remember it's better to choose the right word over the truest rhyme. So I think I can come out of this for a minute. Dropping audio frames. Maybe not. Okay, let me come back. You can Google rhyming dictionary and it'll pull something up for you because I'm afraid this is going to mess up this video and I'm already this far in. So Google rhyming dictionary, type in your word. That's a great resource. I also have some little rhyming dictionaries over on my shelf, and I might put them at the tables as well. Those aren't the greatest. They were in the dollar bin at Target, but they work definitely. So you can always use those. That's helpful when you're trying to write with a rhyme scheme. So what I'd like you to do right now is pause this video. The poetry books that you brought to class today, I'd like you to use those and find examples of 2 different types of rhyme. So again, end, internal, slant, or I. And I want you to write each example with the poem title and poet name on the front of a note card and write the type of rhyme on the back. So I could write 1, 2, 1, 2, and through, the Vorpal blade went snicker snack. That was the Jabberwocky. I would write out those lines 1, 2, 1, 2, and through. I would write Jabberwocky by Lewis Carroll. And then on the back, I would write internal rhyme and rhyme. Okay, because it had both. All right. You want to do that twice and then turn those note cards in because we'll be doing an activity with that later. So make sure you write enough, the entire line, all of the lines. If you need 2 lines, if you need 3 lines, whatever you need in order so that that example is clear. And don't just write the 2 words. If you have internal rhyme like pours bean green over blue, don't just write bean green in the quotes. Write the entire line so that people can identify it, right? And then turn those in. Once you finish that, you can unpause the video and we'll move on to the next assignment. All right, next assignment. You can do this with a partner, or if you prefer to do it on your own, that's totally cool as well. But I'd like you to write a poem entitled The Weekend, which just happened, right? School appropriate, and using one of these rhyming patterns. So ABBA, ABBA, CDE, EFE. Or AABB, CCDD, ABA, BCD, right? So each one of these is 8 lines except for this last one, which kind of ends on that thing, which usually you use a shorter line with that. Pick any one of these patterns. Pick 1, 2, or 3. Don't do all of them. Title it The Weekend and turn that in at the end. After you finish, you're welcome to work on your homework, have a rhyme scheme, poem, go on Google Classroom. It has all of the instructions. So we're just playing around with rhyme right now. Totally encourage you to play around with some of those other types besides and rhyme. And then when we come back, we'll keep working with it. Thanks, guys. Have a great day. Awkward pause while I end the video. Come on, dude.